Amateur Traveler, episode 945. Today, Amateur Traveler talks about kayaks and orcas and seaplanes, farms and flowers and fantan as we go to Victoria, British Columbia. This is Chris Christensen from Amateur Traveler. Let's talk about Victoria. This is another solo episode of Amateur Traveler, although I do have some other voices that will be included in here. But I am just back from Victoria, British Columbia on Vancouver Island. I was there on a press trip. I was there solo, sponsored by Destination Greater Victoria. I had not been to Victoria for some time. So this was my third trip that I've ever made to Victoria. I spent a week there. The first time I was there, just to put it in perspective, was the day the men landed on the moon. So in 1969. The second time I was there after the expo in Vancouver, British Columbia, which was in 1986. And so it had been 39 years since I had been to Victoria. But I found flying in that I still have a great fondness for the city because that first trip that I went there in 1969 was the very first time I left the United States. So the very first country I went to was Canada, and the very first city I went to outside the U.S. was Victoria. So I leapt at the chance to go there again. It is a very beautiful city for those of you who are not familiar with it. Vancouver Island is a large island. It is 456 kilometers or 283 miles long, so not quite 3 times the length of Long Island. And Victoria is at its southernmost point and closest to the U.S. In fact, if you go east from Victoria, you are in Washington State. It's the one part of Canada in the west that sticks below the parallel where the border was set. It is so close to the U.S., in fact, that as I was in the first hotel I was at, which was the Delta Hotel's Victoria Ocean Point Resort, beautiful hotel, I'll talk about that later, I would be looking south onto Victoria Harbor. And in the background, when I was looking, for instance, at the legislature building, were the snow-capped Olympic mountain range, as if they were right behind the building. Any way you looked, it felt like in downtown Victoria, you would see these snow-capped peaks if you looked south. And then if you look to the east, you can see the volcanic peaks of Washington State, including Mount Rainier. I had a full week, so I'm going to jump into my itinerary here, talking about the things I did first, and then getting into where I stayed, and then talking about some of the food opportunities that I had, some of the places that I ate. So when you fly into Victoria, there's 2 different ways to fly in. One is the Victoria International Airport, which is a lovely, easy airport to get into, which is up in Sydney, and then rented a car to get into the city. There is also a second airport in Victoria that is an unusual one because it's the only one that traffic stops when an orca is on the runway, because Victoria has seaplanes that land and take off from its main harbor all the time. I heard different numbers in terms of how many seaplane landings and takeoffs there are in a given year. The lowest number I heard was 10,000. And I believe that number because you can just sit there and watch them come and go. And so the main harbor thoroughfare has seaplane connections with both Seattle and Vancouver, which would be a fun place to get into the city because you'd enter right into the heart of the city, but that is not what I did. The first activity I had was a great way to start the trip, which was a history tour of Chinatown. Victoria has the second oldest Chinatown in North America, second to San Francisco, although actually some of the buildings are older because San Francisco had that great big earthquake in 1906. I did a Chinatown tour with walking tours by Discover the Past. They do Chinatown walks, daytime history tours, and also ghost walks. The company is owned by John and Chris Adams, father and son, and Chris was my guide. Chris grew up here in Chinatown. And so we started across from the Chinatown gate. And one thing to know is the gate that you see, the very colorful gate that welcomes you to Chinatown, is not the entrance to Chinatown. The Gate of Harmonious Interest, as it is called, was built only in 1981. But if you look around the neighborhood there, you'll see these red lampposts. And these lampposts go out multiple blocks from that gate, and they mark the historic extent of Chinatown. And so we started there and heard somewhat about the city's history. Victoria's history really goes back to the settling of that border between the US and Canada, because the Hudson Bay Company had an outpost, a fort at Vancouver, Washington. And when that border was going to be settled, that was no longer going to be in British hands. And so they moved basically up here to Victoria on Vancouver Island. And the Hudson Bay Company being the first colonial presence, the first European presence in the area. There were obviously First Nations there ahead of time. But then the growth of Victoria was really triggered by a gold rush. And that was the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush of 1870. Now, that was on the mainland of British Columbia, but the way that people got there was through Victoria. In the same way that the California Gold Rush wasn't in San Francisco, but caused a boom in that city, as that's where everybody went through. And similarly to San Francisco, one of the big groups that came was the Chinese community. And like San Francisco, also from the Cantonese speaking region of China. In fact, I have to guess that a lot of those people were people who had been down in San Francisco, had been mining there. Now, it wasn't necessarily the goal of all of these people to settle and move to Canada so much as many of them intended to make their fortune and then go home again. That's true with a lot of immigrants across North America, across both US and Canada. One story we learned from Chris is illustrated in a mural. There are a couple different interesting murals in Chinatown. This one is if you're facing Victoria's Chinatown gate, then back up one block on Fisgard Street on the right-hand side as you go away from the gate. And there's a mural of a Chinese family there. A man, his wife, and his elderly mother, and 5 kids. 5, I understand, I think it was 15 kids. And this is the Li Meng Kao family. And this is a mural that depicts the family in 1905. And Mr. Li is the family name comes first, was the first Chinese Canadian employed in federal service. He'd married a Chinese woman from Victoria to start their family, but he had come to Canada via Hong Kong, had learned English, and he worked as an interpreter and customs official, and was able to, which was his goal, to return to China wearing silk. Although many of his family members left after the communists took control of China later on in the 1900s. But Chris told us about this family and some of the struggles that the neighborhood had. For instance, if you're standing at that mural and you turn around, there's a beautiful Chinatown architectural style building that is a school. Well, that school was built because in 1907, Chinese students were excluded from public schools in Victoria. There was also a head tax. So if somebody wanted to immigrate from China into Canada, they were charged $500 per person. And that's at a time when houses could be bought for $3,000. So that was rather a lot of money. And then also, like the US, there were exclusion laws in terms of keeping Chinese out. And through the story of the history of Chinatown that Chris was weaving was the contribution, but also some of the discrimination that they were running into. One other interesting thing that we learned is if you're standing again at that gate, and you look over your right shoulder behind you, there's a large mural on one of the walls there. If you climb up that building, you'll actually come to a temple on the top floor of this. It's a private temple, but it's now been made a historic spot. And this is what Chris had to say about it when we were up there visiting that.
So this temple is really a fascinating place. And we could spend our entire tour time just up here, just digging into what we see around us. There's so much symbolism, so much beauty. Just to put this in context too, think about how important a place like this is, not just for Victoria, because many traditional temples like this in China during the Cultural Revolution were destroyed. So imagine all of this hand embroidery Imagine all of the carved artifacts and goods being taken out onto the street and burnt. But in fact, this is the only Tam Kung Temple outside of Asia. There are two in Hong Kong, there's one in Macau, there's one in Singapore, and then there's this one. Now, Tam Kung is the god that has the place of honor up at the main altar space there. You might have seen his statue as you came in. And that statue arrived in Victoria with a Hakka immigrant during the gold rush, the caribou gold rush of the 1860s. And it's been worshipped here in Victoria ever since. The original gold miner went off to the gold fields and had left the statue behind, and there was an outdoor shrine by the river that used to run through what is now Market Square, which was kind of like the dividing line between the rest of Victoria and Chinatown over here. So the gold miner who brought the statue had gone off. There was an outdoor shrine, which actually in the south of China is very common. But Tam Kung came to someone in a dream, as gods do, and said, this little shrine is nice, but probably time you built me a temple. And a temple was built in the 1870s down on Government Street, a one-story purpose-built temple. That temple was demolished, and this building replaced it, and all the temple goods were moved up here. And that's in 1911. So what we see now is the arrangement from 1911. The temple itself dates to the 1870s, and the statue of Tam Kung has been here since the 1860s. So it's an incredible lineage. But that only scratches the surface of the history of the religious practices here. Because this is actually considered a traditional Chinese folk temple. Some people will refer to it as a Buddhist temple, but it's actually not. What happens here actually predates the entry of Buddhism into China from India by a really long time. It also predates the advent of Taoism within China. Although Taoism and Buddhism have certainly influenced what goes on in a place like this today. So traditional Chinese folk religion, well, that sounds like a made-up name, doesn't it? Because it is. It was made up by academics like me who can't stand things not having names. Because ultimately, many people who practice the religion here wouldn't call it a religion. Religion is an organized thing like Christianity or Islam or Buddhism. This is much more decentralized. Because, for example, there is no clergy here. So Mr. Liang is not a priest. He is the caretaker. His job is to make sure the place is clean and organized. He never gives a sermon or a service or anything like that because, in fact, that never happens here at all. There's no congregation. There's no group of people who come and meet here together at any given time. People come here on their own when they can and at certain special times. And actually, Tam Kung's birthday is coming up, which is one of the reasons why Mr. Liang is preparing ahead the offerings that he'll sell to people who come to thank Tam Kung and seek his help.
That's just a segment of what Chris told us. You'll have to take his tour to learn more, but I would recommend it. We also learned how to play Fan Tan in Fan Tan Alley, which was a Chinese gambling game that you could play even just with your teacups and your coins. You were guessing how many objects were under a cover and gambling on that. The other interesting thing about Fan Tan Alley is there is a sign up there that has all of the legal opium places on a fire map, basically, because while gambling was illegal, opium was legal back here in Chinatown. And not just in Chinatown, people were taking laudanum, for instance, in the other parts of town as well. But at one time, Chinatown was about a quarter of the population of Victoria. So a very important part of the history. So I would recommend that tour. And of course, even better yet, he'll point out some great restaurants right there in Chinatown that you might enjoy. That afternoon, I drove out of town to the west on what they call one of the flavor trails drives. And the flavor trails highlight some of the farms, some of the farm stands, restaurants, and other things that are available in the countryside around Victoria. There were 3 different stops that I did on that drive. One was a food truck, which I'll talk about in a bit, and one was Aylard Farm. And this is a regional park, great place for hiking. Hike down to the rugged coast, looking south towards the Olympic Peninsula. I would highly recommend East Sook Park hike at Aylard Farm. And then I went over to Woodside Farm to do a farm visit there. It's a farm with gardens and a maze built out of apple saplings. And then normally I understand a lot of farm produce, although I was there in May, and so there really wasn't that much available. A better time to go would probably be in the fall for that. The next day, in terms of activities, I went out with Eagle Wing Tours to go find some orcas on a whale watching trip. This was on a fast boat and an open boat. And it's interesting, you show up and they say, okay, we're going to get you geared up. And I knew that we were going to be an open boat. So I had brought a sweatshirt and a jacket. And they said, you probably want to keep those on and put our jacket on top of yours and then these overpants as well, which I wouldn't say were necessarily the most stylish nor thinning pants that I've ever worn. And it seemed like overkill because this was a beautiful spring, May day, shirt sleeve weather, really. So even having a sweatshirt and jacket seemed like way too much clothes. But when you're in a boat and you're going real fast and it's open, it was amazing how quickly we cooled off. And I needed all those layers of clothing, including a hat and putting the hood up over it to keep it on. They typically go about 50 to 60 nautical miles in whatever direction they have heard that the orcas can be found. They share information with other boats and other people who are spotting the orcas, especially at this point. We're talking about residential pods, so pods that live in the area and are well known. Pods are maternal, which I did not know. And you learn a lot of facts about orcas, a lot of facts about other sea life while you're out on this sort of trip. The crew here was a captain and then two people who basically were interacting with the passengers and telling us those sort of facts. We ended up going about 100 nautical miles total, so 50 out and 50 back. So we had a longer cruise than usual, but we did run into some orcas. We ran into what is labeled as the T18/T19 family line. So all of these orcas have names as well as designations, and the matriarchal groups are well known. So this group used to have a grandmother, T18, or Esperanza, that was born in 1955, who they haven't seen in a year, so she is probably deceased. But her daughter, T19, or Muya, was born around 1965 and has two sons. Galeano, who is the larger one, born in 1996. Very notable slight curve and a notch in his dorsal fin is how you can identify him. And then Spouter, his brother, born about 5 years later in 2001. And the male orcas will stay with the family unit, will stay with their mother throughout their entire lifetime, which is fascinating. One of the things I liked about Eagle Creek when I had a chance to sit down with the owner later on in the week is they have a great program for school kids where they have basically four parts to it. They come into the classroom and they teach the kids about the ocean and about some of the sea life and things they'll see. Then they take them out on a boat, as we did, and get a chance to do that. I was amazed how many of these kids who live on an island had not been out on a boat. About 10% have never been to the beach, and 80% have never been on a boat. And then the third part of the program is to do some sort of service project like a beach cleanup. And then they finish this program with an art project that they create to show what they've learned that they'll show to the other kids in the other schools as well. Fascinating program and a really great company that I really enjoyed going out with this particular crew. And I highly recommend that tour. But don't plan on doing a lot that night. It really takes a lot out of you, even though you're just sitting in a boat out there in the sun. The captain said that the crew for the first 2 or 3 weeks of the season just go home and crash after being out in the sun and the wind on these fast boats. The next morning, there was a walk along the water on the Songhees Walkway, and that's a walkway that goes on one side of the harbor. And the harbor, as I said, is an airport. So while you're doing that, you're watching seaplanes take off and land. And you're also watching these water taxis that I swear look like somebody got the design from a toy boat from the bathtub. They're just really adorably cute little water taxis that are plying the waters of the harbor here in Victoria. Victoria is really one of the prettiest cities in North America. I think Vancouver is also has that, on the water feel, but I really do like Victoria just as a pretty city. And I took the Songhees Walkway for a couple miles down to West Harbor, and it's a mixture of paved paths and bridges and wooden walkways along the side of the water. And the Songhees name comes from one of the original First Nations that this would have been their land. After lunch, I did a kayaking expedition with Ocean River Adventures that is down by a drawbridge that was separating the hotel I was staying at from downtown. We took a double kayak from their dock into the upper harbor. So this is away from the legislature building. The upper harbor is separated by that drawbridge. It's a white bridge called the Blue Bridge because it used to be blue, and up towards the gorge. So the water here gets narrower and narrower, but it's not fresh water. It basically is salt water. And we actually went up to a place where there are tidal rapids on the gorge. And so what happens is this part is narrow enough that as the water is coming in from the tide or going out, it forms rapids in this spot. And they don't take kayakers whose skills are of my level through the tidal rapids, but we did go up there. Along the way, we're seeing sea life. We saw a couple otters. We saw some harbor seals, some birds, like we saw a heron along the side. We're seeing people's lovely docks and swimming areas. This area used to be very polluted, apparently, if we go back 50 years or so, but has been cleaned up and is a beautiful part of the city now and kind of fun to see from the water. Just whenever you can get out on the water in Victoria, it's always a good idea. Even when we were doing the whale watching, we spent most of our time doing sightseeing of the land just as we were going to and from where the whales were. And then we kayaked back out into the main harbor. You have to stay obviously out of the way of the seaplanes, but we're able to see the harbor from the kayak as well. And Ocean River Adventures started as a store where you could buy kayaks and such, but they've expanded to do adventures. And they're actually now, as the sons are getting into the business, they're going to be doing both ocean adventures. One of the sons has the record for the fastest kayak around Vancouver Island. I think it was 13 days. And then the other son is more of a river kayaker. And so they're really trying to combine the skills of both, because the river kayakers really need to be able to learn to read the rapids, and the ocean kayakers really need to be able to understand the tides and currents. Since they have skills in both areas, that makes them equipped to do the sort of short tours like I did, but also multi-day tours as well into the San Juan Islands or up Vancouver Island. Fun experience there. Although Victoria is a great walking city. I actually parked the car most of the time that I was in Victoria, as long as I was doing something anywhere between that West Harbor and the Fisherman's Wharf, which is where I took the orca watching tour from. A very colorful, pretty area, Fisherman's Wharf. But anywhere in between there, I was just walking. And that meant that day I had done 8.5 miles of walking and 2 hours of kayaking, and I got back to the hotel and just collapsed. The next day, I hopped in the car again and went further up the island, although not all that far, to the Malahat Skywalk. And this is a tree canopy walk with views over into Washington State and Mount Baker even. And I don't know if you've ever done a skywalk or a canopy stroll. This one was identical to one that I had been at, that I've talked about on the show, that I did in Czechia, or the Czech Republic, depending on what we're calling it these days. You're first doing a canopy walk, which means you're walking up in the trees higher up off the ground. And then you get to this structure that is a sightseeing tower. And it is, I want to say, 8 stories tall or something like that. By stories, you have a path that will loop you on ramps up to the top, and you're probably 8 revolutions before you get to the top, and then have a beautiful view out here at a fjord that cuts into the island north of Victoria. Across the water from you is Sydney, where the airport is, also Butchart Gardens, which would be my next stop. But a beautiful view of the forest in every direction. And there's also some wonderful wood sculptures along the way along this path. And then when you are done with your sightseeing, you can get in a great big corkscrew slide that goes down probably about 6 stories of this. It takes about 16 seconds, according to the video that I shot. You're going to have a hard time shooting a video. You cannot hold your phone in your hand as you're doing this, but I had my Ray-Ban Meta glasses on, so I was able to shoot video with that. But very fun slide, very fun experience, gorgeous sightseeing from there. And then when you get to the bottom, there's an area where you can get snacks. You can get burgers and popcorn. I got some ice cream, pizza. And then I took the trail back to the visitor center. Rather than go back on the canopy walk, I walked underneath the canopy, and there's a nature trail there also with some things for kids to look for and a puzzle that they're putting together. But a real beautiful place. This is the second tower like this, skywalk like this in Canada. There's one in Ontario. And the PR person that I talked to from the Malahat Skywalk said that there are 7 like this in Europe. And frankly, I think every place that has this sort of beautiful view ought to build one of these. They're just really a lot of fun. And then my next stop, I was supposed to take the ferry across Brentwood Bay, this long, skinny bay, to get to Bouchard Gardens. And again, I have nothing against ferry rides, and would recommend that whenever you can, you get out of the water here on Vancouver Island. But I did not because of the timing. I was going to be able to get to Bouchard Gardens by the time the ferry would have left. And so I just drove around. But it's quite a drive to go from one to the other, about an hour even. I had a guided tour of Bouchard Gardens, which is lovely, and thanks to the Bouchard Gardens for providing that. But this is one of the things that I remember seeing in Victoria both the times that I was there before, and one of my most memorable spots. And spoiler here, when I'm standing in the prettiest spot, I'm going to be standing in Bouchard Gardens every time. It is just a beautiful gardens. These are limestone quarries that were built by I said Bouchard Gardens, the Butchart Gardens. I've been saying this wrong for my whole life. It is not Bouchart, it is Butchart. But the Butchart family were in the cement business, and they had a cement factory actually right here where the gardens are now. And some of the very first gardens, the Sunken Garden, which is probably the most famous in Butchart Gardens, is an old limestone quarry that they turned into gardens. But basically, they made a good amount of money in the cement business. And Butchart Gardens starts when Mrs. Butchart, Jeannie Butchart, basically builds the Japanese gardens. These are the oldest gardens on there, with a famous Japanese landscape designer that are right next to the dock. You can still actually come to Butchart Gardens apparently by boat if you have a private boat. And in 1906, she commissioned basically these Japanese gardens as an entryway for their house. So basically, you would get off the boat to come visit the Butcharts, and you would walk through these beautiful gardens with reflecting pools and bridges and a couple torii gates. And they would lead you then into the beautiful house that is the Butchart House. But probably the most well-known gardens is the Sunken Gardens, as I mentioned, and that is the crown jewel, really, of Butchart Gardens here. Instead of this being an old barren pit, they hauled in topsoil because all the topsoil was gone by horse and cart, and shaped this into a multi-level garden. So you have to go down more than one story to get to the base of it. There's still one large feature rock in the middle of it that you can climb up on to look at. There are water features. There's a bog garden for some plants that like it very wet, like ferns. There's also a pond that Mr. Butchart used for fishing. And there's fountains beyond that are used for fountain light shows. And then I was there in May, and in May, think tulips and daffodils. The tulips and the daffodils were just past their peak. So probably if I'd been there late April, been a beautiful amount of tulips. It was still quite lovely now, but you could tell it was a little past its peak. If you waited another month, you'd start to get into the roses. Not just in the rose garden will you find roses, but there will be other roses on the property. But there is a rose garden that was established in 1929, used to be the old vegetable garden, and will be just bursting with roses coming here starting in summer. In the fall, you'll see more fall colors. There's a lot of Japanese maples and such that will add to that. In winter, they decorate for Christmas with a lot of Christmas lights throughout the property. So there's something in every season. Probably, I would say the best time to visit, though, would be in April to get those tulips, or in early summer in June to get the roses at their peak. There's also an Italian garden. She converted the old tennis court into an Italian garden, a symmetrical small garden in a European style. And then there's the Mediterranean garden that is right near the house that contains drought tolerant species from all over the world. That's a more recent addition. Multiple generations have taken over the gardens since the original Butch Arts. Their grandson took it over just after World War II, and he's the one who opened the gardens to the public. Again, this was something where it was only friends who would come see the gardens at first. But in 1939, Ian Ross, who's the grandson, starts charging admission and starts promoting the gardens. And also then he introduces summer evening entertainment as well as the Magic of Christmas winter event that I mentioned. But they still do summer concert series, and they also have fireworks nights in the summertime as well. And so those are notable to this day on very, very popular events. And it was Ian's son, Christopher Ross, who added the fireworks shows in 1977. His sister, Robin Lee Clark, is the current owner and manager of Butch Art Garden. Again, a descendant of the original Butch Arts. It's the one place that I think I don't really have to tell people to go to in Victoria. It is probably the best known and oldest tourism spot in Victoria, beloved and justly so. It is a beautiful, beautiful place. Oh, a couple little tidbits. So there is a carousel that you can pay a little fee to ride if you're coming with kids, especially. If you go to the carousel, take a note, there is one place in the carousel where there is a dog, and shortly in front of the dog is a cat. Those are modeled after the family pets. Winston is the dog, and the dog is labeled as Winston, was always chasing the cat. And so when that carousel was added in 2009, the great-granddaughter of Jeannie Butch Art had 30 hand-carved wooden animals there, including this tribute to the old family pets. The next day, I had a guided tour at the Royal BC Museum, which is right next to the legislature building, so just off of the harbor. And we started at some of the historic buildings, which are right there on site. So we started at the Helmken House, which was built in 1852. It's one of the oldest houses in British Columbia. It's not always open. So if you do get a chance to visit sometime when that is open, it's the residence of a doctor or one of the prominent physicians and politicians, old family in British Columbia, and it's worth a visit if it's open. Also on the site is Thunderbird Park there, which was established during World War II, and it displays a collection of totems and indigenous carvings representing the various First Nations of the region. And then we went inside the museum. And before I went to the museum, people, when they heard that I was going to the museum, said, well, you have to check out the Old Town exhibit. That was a real favorite exhibit of locals. And it is really one of the best exhibits in the museum. It looked really familiar. So I'm thinking I remember it from the visit that I had in 86, because it's been around for a while. But basically, they took part of the museum and turned it into a recreation of Victoria from the age of gas lamps on one side and electricity on the other. So just really during that transition around the turn of the century, you can hear the sounds of a blacksmith shop, and you can peek around the corner, but you can't quite see the blacksmith working, or you can hear the train come by in the train station. So it's not just that you can see things, but there's more of an interactive, immersive quality to it, which is kind of fun. There's also a theater there, and in the theater, one of the things that they were telling the story of is one of the newer exhibits that they've just added to the old town is a photography studio, a recreation of a photography studio from a photographer who was Japanese, who documented one of the local towns just before World War II. And the Japanese in Canada, just like in Western US, were relocated. And so the demographic makeup of that town changed a lot with the relocation of the Japanese population. But this photographer, who was himself Japanese, captured this particular moment in time. And there's an exhibit there. But my guides had this to say about the exhibit.
So as we're reimagining the museum gallery spaces, we're rethinking some of the individual displays within a space like Old Town, which people love, but also we want to expand and build on the stories that are present here. Old Town, actually, a lot of times people think that it's Victoria, Old Victoria, but it's actually composite different areas all around British Columbia. Okay. So this is called the Hayashi Photography Studio. It's based on an actual space in Cumberland, BC, which is on Vancouver Island, but north of here.
And Hayashi was a real...
Yeah, Hayashi was a real individual.
His name was, Sanjuro Hayashi, and he founded the photography studio in 1912.
And this photography studio was really important for Cumberland, but also beyond Cumberland too, because he was capturing the images of individuals all around Cumberland at a time when it wasn't as easy to do as it is now. And especially when we're talking like that sort of speaks to some around the Japanese internment in World War II, being able to capture this vibrant town and the Japanese community within Cumberland at that time was really important and significant.
And what was really interesting is when we did this opening, we actually had descendants of the Hayashi family, and then the photographer who took over after Hayashi retired, which was the Matsubushi family, just to have them here and be able to point, like there's a picture and they're like, that's my mom, or different things like that. And then we're also making this more interactive is another piece that's happening. So if you click on any of the photos on that screen, you'll see they get projected up on the big screen. Oh. And then they're also going to be putting in here eventually as well. They're calling it 1917, 1912 a selfie station type of thing. That it'll be telling you the process of how a photo was taken during that time. And then they'll take a picture and then you'll be able to see it on the other side with the other pictures on the other side of the wall here.
Oh, that's fun.
So that'll be really neat.
One other thing just to say about it is that this was not created just by us. This was created with community partners. So the Cumberland Museum and the Nikkei National Museum for the Japanese Historical Museum were crucial in creating this together. So that co-creation with community partners is also a really important part of the work we're doing going forward.
So that was one of my favorite exhibits. They also had a recreation of Captain Vancouver's ship, after whom Vancouver Island is named. And I did like the detail that I wouldn't have noticed it. But check if you can, when you come into the ship, it's freshly painted and it's brand new and it's in port in England is where it's supposed to be. But as you go out the other side, now you're in the New World and the ship is a little more weathered and has barnacles on the hull and has been through some things. And so that's the ship as it would have looked when it was exploring Vancouver Island, which I just love that little touch. It was interesting doing a tour, and I wish that you could all do the same tour that I did, but that isn't necessarily available. As you're hearing people who work with the museum talking about how they're working with the community to re-envision things like the First Nations displays, or how the Chinese community is represented in Old Town, and making even simple changes. For instance, Old Town is fairly dimly lit, but the Chinese portion was even more dimly lit, and that was something that the Chinese community said, I'm not sure why you're representing it that way. Can we change that? And they went, oh, sure. We hadn't even think about that cast negative aspersions on the Chinese community. And so I'd love to hear how they're working with the community to try and better interpret the story of British Columbia. The museum is not just a history museum, but also a natural history museum. And so there are portions there that have recreations of the woods where they actually went out and took an actual section of woods and modeled the trees after that section of woods and have tide pools coming in, things like that. It's a cool museum. The Chinatown tour and the museum are probably really the best way to get your handle on some of the history in the area. And that afternoon, I got on a bike. Victoria is a very bikeable city, and so I borrowed a bike from Cycle BC right near the legislator building and cycled down to Fisherman's Wharf, where I had a chance to meet up with Brett Soberg, who I mentioned, the captain and co-owner of Eagle Wing Tours that I'd done the whale watching tour with, and then continued to cycle down the coast out along the water outside of the bay, and then circled back in through the town and got a chance to enjoy bike lanes in many places, which were lovely. A few hills. There was definitely a place where I was told if you really don't want to do hills, you need to turn left here, but they had cycle maps so that I had an idea of where I was going. But the town does have good cycle lanes in a lot of different places if you want to get around by bike. In terms of things I did, the only thing I'll mention that I did more as an activity, but you could also do as a place to eat, is I did do a brewery tour and a tasting at the Phillips Brewery. Phillips Brewing and Malting Beer Shop. I had the impression, and those of you who are listening who are from Canada know how silly I was. I thought I was going to a local craft brew place. And if you walk in, that's really the ambiance you get. And you get the colorful labels and you get all the different varieties of beer. And when they started talking about how many different cans they can produce and that they're distributed all across Canada, I realized that I had the wrong picture of Phillips, as those Canadians listening already knew. So we're talking about a place that can put out 400 cans a minute for 12 hours for 5 days a week. So that's rather a lot of beer that is being produced here. The interesting story behind it is they started in 2001, and the original brewer couldn't get a loan from the bank to do this kind of craft style beer. And so just got a lot of credit cards and spent things up on credit cards, but it has worked out. Obviously, they're doing very well. He handmade his own first fermentation tanks. He would make 2 tanks, he would use one, and he would sell the other to help pay for the brewery. Quite a large facility. I was able to get a tour. Unfortunately, they don't do tours anymore unless you've got a podcast or something. They do malt their own barley. They make their own signs. They have a local sign maker. Obviously, they brew a lot of beer. They also do concerts there. But one interesting thing about the beer there is I'm used to that in my area in California, the most popular beers I would say are IPAs. And I am not a fan of hops and so not a fan of IPAs. The most popular beers at Phillips are lighter beers, less hoppy. And so I tried the tasting flight of the Tilt and the Blue Buck, for instance, which are popular beers for them. And not very hoppy, lightly sweet, kind of a good summer beers, I would say. But that's their most popular beers. And then I also tried some of their sours because I tend to like a good sour. But their sours were sweeter than I expected. So they were quite a different style of beer, quite tasty, but not usually what you would expect. So I tried the Glitter Bomb and a couple of their Dino Sours, which I just love the name of. I had, for instance, the Dino Sour Stone Fruit. I really enjoy their beers. Quite different, though. They did have, if you're into the hoppy beers, they had those as well. But I was surprised that those weren't necessarily their most popular beers. The Blue Buck used to be the Blue Truck because they started delivering their beers in a blue milk truck, but they got sued by somebody else who had Blue Truck in their name, and so they changed that one to Blue Buck. But they still have a Blue Truck out there in the area where they do concerts that you can see if you were there. Check out Phillips Beer if you're either in Canada someplace or if you happen to get to Victoria. In terms of places where I stayed, I said the first place I stayed, so I was there for 6 nights total, and the first 3 I was at a Marriott property, which is a Delta Hotel, and it's the Ocean Point Resort. It's really on the opposite end of the main bay from the legislative building, from the famous Empress Hotel, where my mom wanted to go have tea, but I don't think she ever did when we were there in '69. And the best thing about the hotel is the view. It really is in a lovely spot. And if you stay there, you absolutely should get a room with a view. Get one that faces out towards the bay, because I just loved sitting there in front of my window with this wonderful view of the bay. Bring your telephoto lens if you want to get a picture of the Empress Hotel or Legislative Building across the way, or some of the tall ships or whatever. But it was a very comfortable stay. I would definitely recommend the Delta Hotel there at the Ocean Point Resort. Also had a chance to eat breakfast in their restaurant, which is the Lure restaurant, Lure. I only had a chance to eat breakfast there, so I can't recommend lunch or dinner, but it looked good for lunch and dinner as well from the menu. But they had a great cinnamon roll French toast they would highly recommend for breakfast. The French toast had pecans and fresh fruit and whipped cream and just, yum, very good. And then the other half of the week, I stayed in the Oswego Hotel way over in the other side of town. So now I'm past the legislature building and almost all the way to Fisherman's Wharf on the southern side of the bay, a little set off from the bay, about 2 blocks off the bay. And this was another lovely hotel, quite different because this was more of an apartment style room where you walk into the room and there's a full living room with a full kitchen equipped there. They also had a restaurant that I ate the breakfast at, the Adair restaurant, where I had breakfast there also. It had the waffles, not the French toast, but also good. While I'm naming breakfast places, I also had breakfast at Murchie's Tea and Coffee. And so this is a place that is really more of a coffee bar, tea place, but they do have pastries as well as breakfast sandwiches and other breakfast items there. I did try the Earl Grey with vanilla, a little too sweet for me. I would do it without the vanilla next time, but a good breakfast there. Wonderful bakery items there, especially. And then the morning that I was walking along the Songhees Walkway to the West Harbor, they had me eating brunch at Boom and Batten, a Boom and Batten restaurant and cafe, which is a beautifully situated restaurant right along a marina, right on the harbor with the seaplanes taking off. So it's a great place to stop just for the view. And they had shakshuka for breakfast. That's one I'm not going to pass up. I don't know if you know shakshuka. They had more traditional breakfasts as well, but shakshuka is a North African dish with poached eggs and a spicy tomato sauce with onions and various spices. Definitely something that I'm going to go for if it's available because I don't get it very often. And then I also had breakfast at Cafe Fantastico, and that was a place where I just hung out with my laptop for an hour and got some work done. It's that kind of vibe. They had fresh scones, they had breakfast sandwiches, and tea and coffee there. Some of the places I did for lunch, I mentioned that I did that drive on the first full day there out to the West Shore Flavor Trail, out to the Barns and Beaches and Beyond is what they called it, where I was out hiking along the shore and things like that. They had me at a hide and seek food truck. And so this is a food truck out there that was doing some fusion food, I would say, fusion Asian sort of things. I had the Wiggly Jiggly, which is a rice bowl with pork belly, salad greens, pineapple salsa, really very tasty bok choy. Lunch the next day was down in the waterfront in downtown, right near where the seaplane terminal is, at Redfish Bluefish. And Redfish Bluefish is a seafood only place. So you got to love seafood to go to this place. I had the fish and chips, but they had other dishes as well down there. A very casual sort of place where you're eating out on the wharf at tables, watching the view, but a fun lunch. And then dinners. And I would say there was a variety of styles of food that I had. The first night, I met up with somebody from the tourism board at the Drake Eatery, and this is really a brew pub kind of style of food. And so lots of beers on tap. I ended up getting a brat. It's that kind of brat and beer kind of place, very casual. The next night was quite the opposite. This would be one of those places I would really recommend for foodies, and that was the House of Boteng. They were recently awarded the best brunch restaurant of Victoria. I was not there for brunch. I was there for dinner. It had kind of an adventurous palate to it in the sense that, for instance, the cocktail I had, I think it was a mocktail because I needed to get some work done that night, was made with mustard as one of the predominant flavors and had kind of a salty flavor to it. And so it were things that I didn't necessarily expect. I had the jerk chicken, and it was a beautiful meal and quite tasty, but would often have different ingredients that I wouldn't expect in a dish like that. So I thought they were creative, but not too much so. It wasn't like you needed like weird things to enjoy it, but they put together a flavor palette that I thought was quite different. And so definitely for foodies, I would recommend that one. The next night I ate at Finn's Seafood Chop Cocktails. And that is a place that I'd say you don't have to be necessarily as adventurous. It has seafood, it has steaks, it has burgers, it has pizza, and it has an incredible view. It's right on the harbor, and go at sunset. Just go at sunset and sit out on the patio, especially on one of those May days like I was doing there, where you needed a sweatshirt, but just a gorgeous view. And I enjoyed the food, a little less adventuresome than the night before. I did the potato chip and buttermilk fried chicken breast sandwich, and along with the truffle and Parmesan fries, and that was excellent. The next night, I ate at 10 Acres Bistro, and this is a real farm to table experience because 10 Acres Bistro has 10 acres of land outside of Victoria. They are basically bringing in a lot of ingredients fresh from their farm. One of the things I appreciated, and this is one of those little things about when you're doing one of these trips and you're eating out every time, is they had some things in their pasta, for instance, where you could get a half order. I've been eating out so much that I ended up ordering the bolognese just because I could get it in a half order, where I couldn't do that with some of the other dishes. They had a number of wines by the glass, which I appreciated, especially being there by myself. So I tried one of the local Merlots from BC. And then, of course, because I'd had a half order of pasta, I still had room for a slab of pecan pie for dessert. And I would definitely recommend that as well. But a very good experience. I enjoyed 10 Acre Bistro. The next night, I ate at Rabbit Rabbit Wine Bar. And this is, again, is a place that I would recommend for foodies. Rabbit Rabbit is inspired by Alice in Wonderland, although I wouldn't say you walk in and see that the restaurant is particularly Alice in Wonderland themed, but you will see some theming there of vinyl albums and things like that. And I think I was there on a Tuesday. On a Monday night, if I had been there, most of the restaurants are closed in the area. And so they try to do something special where they will play some album, some vinyl album, and then have a meal that is appropriate for that. So, for instance, the day before I was there, they were playing albums by Queen, and they had an extra menu item for Coronation Chicken in honor of Queen, where I think the week before they had the Beatles versus the Rolling Stones, and say they were switching off different vinyl from those two bands, and they had fish and chips on the menu, which they wouldn't normally have. Although they may have to add that, I guess that was very popular. And so some of their items are very simple, like proper English chips, and some are a little different, like they have a lasagna that is homemade pasta, but then has a gochujang, which is a Korean sauce, bolognese, miso, brown butter, tomato sauce, pan-seared and finished with Parmesan. That is not your mother's lasagna. It was good, but there were some flavors in there that I did not expect. And so that's why I say this is really one of those places that I think foodies will particularly enjoy. And of course, it is a wine bar, so lots of wines available there. And save room for the bread pudding, too. That one includes rabbit candies that have been melted inside the bread pudding. Rabbit is one of the only things you will not find on the menu at Rabbit Rabbit because it just seems wrong to the owner. And then the last place I had dinner and cocktails at Fathom, which is the restaurant inside of the Hotel Grand Pacific, which is right on the harbor, close to the legislature building. And I met yet another representative from the tourism board there. I ordered what I was told was the best burger in Western Canada, and it is probably the best burger I've had in Western Canada, so I certainly can't prove that wrong. It was a Wagyu beef burger, while Aaron ordered the seafood tagliatelle. But again, do save room for dessert, and this seems like this may be a theme here. I rather enjoyed the cold brew Basque cheesecake with a Bailey's Shaft cremant and graham streusel on it. Very good. It had a little bit of a coffee flavor. I'm not really a big coffee fan, but not so much that I didn't like it. And those are the different places that I ate. This week, by the time this comes out, or next week, I should have some of these in blog posts with some pictures so that you can see some of the things I ate or some of the things that I saw. As I get to some of my wrap-up questions, the standard wrap-up questions, you know the answer to the first one. I'm standing in the prettiest spot. Where am I standing? What am I looking at? I am in the Sunken Garden in Bouchard Gardens, and I knew that before I went. Although I will say that hike I did at Aylard Farm out to the coast, the rugged, rocky coastline there, really would be possibly even a tie for that. One thing that makes me laugh and say only in Victoria, that whole thing about sometimes they have to close down the airport because there's an orca on the runway, I think is just hilarious. The seaplanes is just not something that I'm used to, and I just had to watch everyone that went by. Pretty fun. And then if I had to summarize Victoria in 3 words, what 3 words would I use? Historic, stunning, and delicious. And I think that wraps up my trip to Victoria. Thanks to the tourism board there for sponsoring my trip. It was just so great to get back to a city that I have a real soft spot in my heart for. A big thanks to the patrons of the show who help support Amateur Traveler financially. If you're interested in learning more about becoming a patron of the show, you can go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler. And you can join us next Saturday for a monthly Patreon Zoom call. I heard from 2 former guests of the show talking about the episode we did recently on Auckland, New Zealand. One was Randy Rohr, who said several years ago I started out my 3-week trip around New Zealand and Auckland. I spent several days in Auckland and really enjoyed it. I recommend taking the short ferry ride across the bay to Devonport. I spent a lovely morning there walking around the town with shops and cafes. The oldest movie theater in New Zealand is there. There are great views of Auckland looking back from Devonport and from the ferry. Another fun thing to do in Auckland is a short sailing trip on America's Cup-style racing boat. They let folks take the wheel for a bit. You can find the racing boat across from the very nice Maritime Museum. The other former guest I heard from was Jonty Crane, who did that episode, who said, I just listened to it, and I should have said Peter Blake, not Roger Blake. Peter Blake was the New Zealand sailor famous for wearing red socks, winning the America's Cup, and being killed by pirates in the Amazon. Thanks for the correction, Jonty, and thanks for the comments, Randy. There are new things on the blog at amateurtraveler.com. Check out the 3 posts that I wrote about my trip to Japan, hiking in Kyushu with Walk Japan, Japanese etiquette for your trip to Japan, and a ryokan experience staying in a traditional Japanese hotel. Also check out the guest post we have on 15 days from Marrakesh to the Sahara and beyond in Morocco. There are still spots available for next year's trip to the stands to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. If you're interested in learning more about that, either drop me an email or go to amateurtraveler.com/trips. And with that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to chris2x@gmail.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.